All right. Well, the liberty movement is in a state of utter disarray, and a lot of it has to do with the conflict between Israel and Gaza that's been ongoing since the terrorist attack by Hamas on October 7th. It's roiling politics, left, right, center, libertarian, communist, anarchist, minarchist, or what have you. And Hollywood, of course, is no different. There's been a blacklist circulating of people who might have pro-Israel views, or just people who haven't said anything about Israel at all. Donald Trump, he'll say anything about anything. And he says that if you're a Democrat, or you're a Jewish Democrat, you're out of your mind. People like Alan Dershowitz and others, with the state of the Democratic Party, I have to say, definitely going with Donald Trump on this one. Joining us now to discuss is Ian Haworth. He's a Jewish gentleman himself and a conservative, and he's joining us live. It's been quite a while since we've seen him, so welcome back. Ian, nice to see you, brother.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Love the shirt as always. Great to be back.
Thank you, Ian. Grateful to have you here, brother. Donald Trump was talking about Alan Dershowitz the other day, and he was saying, if you're looking at how the Democrat Party is behaving during these protests on college campuses, calling him Genocide Joe, if you're a Jew and you're still a Democrat, and keep in mind, I have some Jewish Democrat family members, so I have to be a little careful here.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's hard to talk to them about Donald Trump, right? It's like, not listening. But I kind of agree with him. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the sentiment of what he's putting forward. I think the way he did it is stereotypically terrible because, well, guess what? It's Donald Trump. He says things. He's not he's a smooth talker as an entertainer. I think when it comes to policy, gets a little bit dodgy. I think he blurred the line between loyalty to Israel and America that I think raises a lot of red flags for people, I think quite rightly. The concern for me from the very beginning, I think you can have two concerns. You can have one, a concern for what's going on in Israel, but also what's happening to Americans, not just the Americans who are still being held hostage in Gaza, by the way, that very few people seem to care about, but also the anti-Semitism that is happening domestically as a result of Democratic Party policy. So I think Donald Trump doesn't need to even mention Israel right now. If we're talking about American Jews, just look outside your window. Look what's happening to American Jewish students on college campuses across the country, not just one, not just two, quite literally across the country. That should be enough to motivate people to think that maybe Joe Biden kissing ass of jihadis in Michigan isn't a great idea if you actually care about the country, if you care about Western values, if you care about your Jewish neighbors. I wish that's the tack he took. But of course, deep down, he's utterly correct.
How do you deal with Jewish Democrats in this election? I mean, just let it lie, let them see the situation as it is right now, because I feel like a little bit of prodding might be necessary,
Yeah.
with everything's at stake, Ian. I mean, how should I approach my Democratic Jewish in-laws about this topic? What would you say?
I mean, I think you have to, because I think if you just ignore issues, then the Democrats always circle the wagon. They always find a way to bring people in under a worse sense of victimhood, a greater danger. Like, yeah, Israel is on fire right now. The whole world is on fire. Joe Biden is destroying the economy. But what about the threat to democracy, Austin? Like, we've got to think about these kind of things. There's always a greater threat out there that just happens to erase all of the things Democrats are doing wrong. So I think we absolutely have to talk to Jewish Democrats. I think the main way of doing it is to try and make this not about Trump and make this all about Biden. That's really my advice for Republicans during this entire election, because there are people out there who hate Trump, and that blinds them to really what's going on right now and why Joe Biden is so much worse. Like, you don't have to be a fan of Trump to admit that Joe Biden has been appalling on basically any front that you look at. That's really the tact I take. I also look at things on almost a value level. So I talk about, this is why the Second Amendment needs to exist. This is why things like the First Amendment need to exist. And then you get into the weeds of what is and isn't under the First Amendment in terms of violent rhetoric on campus, in terms of actually calling for violence or just saying things you don't like. Like, this is how we get into conservative values or right-wing values or just not radical left-wing values without having to mention the name Trump. I think that's the key to it, is to not make this about personalities, make this about values.
There's a fear amongst people, and this has been echoed by conservatives like Matt Walsh and others, about the pushback against the obvious anti-Semitism that we're seeing on college campuses and from the left. There's a fear that there's an overreaction in a crackdown on what is free speech. I mean, it's illegal and allowable to not like
Mhm.
the state of Israel and its foreign affairs. It's legal and allowable to not like Jews as a culture or an ethnicity because even hate speech is allowed under the First Amendment. It seems, though, as if the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, and others, they take a very blunt hammer, Maccabee's hammer, if you will, when it comes to the question of free speech that I find disconcerting when it comes to the question of what should be allowable speech. Where do you fall on that issue?
Yeah, I definitely encourage everyone listening right now just to check out what I've written and what I've talked about on this issue, because I think this is where all of the nuance is being lost, and where a lot of conservative Jews who care about these issues too often get being pushed to the side because there are some louder voices out there who I don't think often actually care about anti-Semitism, especially on the political side. There are a lot of people who want to use this issue to basically create a fireworks show for their own action. It's like, look at me, I'm ending anti-Semitism. I mean, even in states that respect the First Amendment, for example, Greg Abbott reacting to these college so-called protests, saying that anti-Semitism will not be accepted. Like, that's not even the legislation that he was pushing. It's just the lazy wording because you want to be seen as the great hero coming to save people. But again, anti-Semitism generally does fall under the First Amendment. My issue is always threats of violence, incitement of violence, direct threats. That's what we should be focusing on because guess what? That's what's happening on campuses. We're also seeing actual acts of violence. I would much rather see people focusing on those that we also have existing laws for, by the way. Beating someone unconscious in the street, regardless of whether they're Jewish or not, is already illegal. And so that's kind of the issue I come at from that direction. But there's also a lot of, I don't want to say lies, but falsehoods being pushed about, for example, the Title VI changes to do with anti-Semitism. People saying that if you quote scripture, you're going to be thrown in jail. That's just false on multiple levels. That's not me defending the legislation. I think Title VI is terrible and everything to do with it is terrible. But there's just a lack of really intellectual honesty going on because there's a lot of people on both sides basically pushing fear-mongering tactics just to get attention, just to get clicks, just to get their own group behind them. So there's a lot of people, for example, trying to make this about anti-Christian bigotry, and anti-Christian bigotry or anti-Catholic bigotry is far worse than anti-Jewish bigotry, and no one cares about that, etc. We should care about all religious bigotry because that's the basis of this country, is fighting back against that kind of thing. So where I should be seeing unity, I'm seeing fracturing, whether it's to do with Judaism or not.
One of the accusations that's made by people, and many of them are, it's coming from the right. The left would never say this because they have their own dual loyalties. But the question of dual citizenship, I wonder where you stand on this issue. I don't have a particularly strong opinion on it because it's not something that I've considered very deeply. But I see some
Mhm.
people in the chat are asking about it. They're saying that, that I'm not a fan of dual citizenship. Mommy, she says in the chat, you are either loyal to Israel or you're loyal to the United States. Pick one. I mean, it does seem to be a problem, when we're talking about political actors, especially some, for example, if you're a member of Congress, and the United States does have a law that prevents like the president of the United States from not being a natural born citizen. I think a lot of people would have a problem with a president who had some kind of a dual citizenship status. How do you feel about something like that? Do you have a particularly strong opinion on this topic?
Yeah, I think on the level of just the citizenship alone, I don't really have a problem. I haven't really thought about it too deeply. I know, for example, Ann Coulter and Vivek Ramaswamy talked about what citizenship means, and loyalty to them is central to that. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I need to do some thinking about that. I think on the issue of Israel, I think it gets a little bit sticky because what does loyalty mean? And also, you can be pro-Israel because you are pro-America. I think that's a very subtle logical trick that a lot of people play. And they say that there are some people out there who are pro-Israel, therefore they're anti-America. That's simply not true. You can be both, but also you can disagree with the policy. I think that's the insinuation that's made that is often, to quote the left, problematic, in that, oh, you want to give aid to Israel, therefore you're anti-America. It's like, well, you can be anti all forms of aid because you hate Israel or because you hate giving foreign aid when we have far bigger problems at home. I think a lot of this comes
I'm
down
the
to
latter.
intent.
I'm
Yeah.
on the latter
Yeah.
side of that. Yeah.
But unfortunately, there are a lot of people who are on the former. And so I think that's the issue for me, is that what does loyalty mean? I think there are a lot of people out there, for example, who are faking loyalty, the kind of people who put Ukraine flags in their bio, Israel flags in their bio, things like that. There is a difference between differentiating yourself. For example, I have a Star of David in my bio, mainly just to piss off anti-Semites because right now it's a terrible environment. I want to be quite proud about who I am, what I believe. But I think there's a big difference between that and having a foreign entity's flag, flags mean something. It means something when people wave the Palestinian flag, and to a far less offensive level, it means something when people wave the Ukrainian flag, especially in Congress, and therefore it means something if you wave the Israeli flag. And so I'd much rather be talking on, again, lines of policy rather than the virtue signaling identity politics nonsense of I'm waving this particular flag, therefore I love everything about this country, or therefore I hate America. It's simply not that simple, but people make it so just to divide people because it's very easy politically.
Yeah, boy, this is a good conversation, Ian, and I'm glad that you're here to have it with us. And I'm grateful for you getting up so early and being so generous with your time here on this, because I would be far less offended to see the members of Congress waving an Argentinian flag in support of Javier Milei than if they were to wave a flag of Palestine in favor of Palestine, because I don't see the two as morally equivalent. But I
Hmm.
think that the big problem is that especially on what I would term explicitly as the isolationists of the right, they see it all as the same, as all
Hmm.
foreign nations. We want to close off not only our foreign relations with them, but we also want to close off international trade with them. That they very much they love to equivocate or between two nations as if there is a moral difference, as if there's a um, moral equivalence between the what Israel stands for, or what the people in the Gaza Strip stand for, or the people of Argentina stand for. It's just not the same. But we sort of lost the nuance in this discussion because we have not only partisans and ideologues and special interests who are behind the scenes fanning the flames, but the people who tend to be the ones who are the loudest voices tend to be the most either insane, batshit insane, or the people who control the media to some extent and aren't going to allow opinions like yours and mine. Thank God we have Rumble and other
Hmm.
platforms we can have these conversations, Ian. But on the question of how to deal with anti-Semitism here in the United States, if I were to offer a criticism of the state of Israel, that would come from me as someone who believes that Israel is not morally equivocal to their enemies in Hamas or on the Gaza Strip. It's to say that there certainly hasn't been a charm offensive from Israel, that the approach has been very much the hammer, and every problem is a nail, right? Where the promise of the reason why the United States offers foreign aid to Israel ostensibly, and this is what Benjamin Netanyahu said himself, and I'll be curious how you respond to this, has been that in exchange for the weapons and the money that is offered to Israel, we're supposed to have peace and security in the Middle East. There hasn't been a lot of peace. There hasn't been a lot of security in the Middle East. I mean, at some point, beyond any kind of a special interest here, strategically, what is the interest that the United States has in Israel if the continuations of violence and the political turmoil that it brings to the United States seems to outweigh the benefits of providing Israel with the kind of foreign aid that I know that you said you've supported in the past? I don't, but I'd be curious to see how you would respond to those
Hmm.
criticisms.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, so I'm just going to try and meander my way through it. I
Sure.
think one is that I'm not often openly calling for foreign aid sent to Israel. I think in many ways Israel doesn't need it. I think it can be arguably be advantageous to the United States, both in terms of knowledge sharing, technology sharing, the development of technology, but also keeping terrorism on one side of the planet rather than our side. But I would be perfectly happy for the United States to stop funding Israel, at least militarily. My issue is that you've got to have that view across the board. And a huge part of the reason why we don't have so-called peace in the Middle East is if we compare this to the time under Donald Trump, where he had a completely revolutionary and also obvious response to the unrest in the Middle East, in that if you don't take Iran seriously, if you don't let them have a place at the table, if you don't elevate terrorism, and then you elevate the countries in the Middle East who actually want to pursue some form of peace. This isn't saying that countries like Saudi Arabia or UAE or all these other nations are perfect, and they're certainly not. But they're not the ones advocating for the complete erasure of another country simply because Jews live there. Iran is. Countries like Syria are. Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah certainly are. And Joe Biden is also effectively funding both sides of the conflict right now. So that's really where I start to push back a little bit when people raise the issue of aid. It's like, I'd be perfectly fine in the conversation of cutting off aid if you're also saying with exactly at least as much effort that we should be cutting off aid for the other side that is going straight into the hands of quite literal terrorists. For
Yeah,
example,
you're right.
this
No,
dock we're
yeah.
building for Gaza right now to drop off humanitarian aid. Wonderful if that actually gets into the hands of people who need it. It's not. It's going straight to Hamas, and Hamas are not only killing Palestinians because Hamas are responsible for all of the bad things that happen to Palestinians almost entirely, but also we are enabling the enemy of what is supposed to be an ally, which is not how wars should be fought. And so I think a big part of this, when you talk about the hammer approach of Israel, is you've got to zoom out and understand this from a decades long conflict, which it is, if not longer, and that Israel have really lost patience. And then you've also got the element of Israel, this modern state of Israel being founded directly after World War II, where people didn't really care about the persecution of not only Jews, but a lot of minorities during World War II. We like to do a bit of history revisionism of, yes, the United States, yes, the UK, yes, Canada, and yes, the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis. And thank goodness from my life and the life of my family that they did. But the purpose of World War II was not to end the Holocaust. That was a wonderful side product. I mean, if you look at the actual persecution of Jews prior to World War II, the West turned a blind eye. A lot of Jews were not permitted to enter the UK. There's a lot of scandals going on there. A lot of Jews weren't permitted to enter the US, and the results were disastrous. You can't necessarily blame them because no one really knew what was going to happen long term and how horrific the Holocaust would be. But in the same way, you can't then say that the United Kingdom in 1939 and then in 1942 and onwards, the United States entered the war to end the Holocaust. They simply didn't. And so when you look at Israel, they feel alone because in many ways they are. I think that's why they are so aggressive and
I
really
understand.
so
And
relentless.
listen, I understand carrot and stick diplomacy, but it does appear as if it has been nothing but stick diplomacy and there haven't been too many carrots offered. I mean, even in something like a charm offensive would be nice because at the moment, I think that that Israel is definitely losing the propaganda wars when it comes to the United States and how American people feel. I think most people tend to feel if they're not very strongly opposed to Israel in many ways, then they tend to be rather indifferent. The American people are somewhat isolationist from a bit of a default position. And of course, there are people in the
Mhm.
United States who absolutely support Israel and many of these people make up the right in the Republican Party. But that's not all of the right in the
Mhm.
Republican Party. The dissident right of the Republican Party has taken a very strong anti-Israel tack, and I would say very anti-Semitic tack in recent in since October 7th. I think probably that was really more of the symptom than the cause. The response that we saw from so many people who identify themselves on the political right, who sort of the snake sort of reared its ugly head, if you will. People like Candace Owens and Kanye West and others who Jake, what's his name, the fighter who got punched in the head a bunch of times, right? Who they say things like, "Oh, we're not anti-Semitic, we're just anti-Zionists," but you and I know that that's bullshit, right? I'm a political veteran. I've been around for 15 to 20 years. I've had plenty of conversations with these people, and I know quite well what their motives are and what they are. And when you hear people talking about, the Jews killed Jesus, then they go immediately from Israel to the question of the actual ethnic Jews, then it's not about Zionism, it's about Semitism, right? But I'm curious your thoughts about what we've seen with like the rise of the anti-Semitism on the right again. The America First Committee of the 1930s of the interwar period between World War I and World War II, it was explicitly anti-Semitic. Henry Ford and others, they advanced conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. We're seeing these conspiracy theories return. Many of the people that I agree with, we should end the Federal Reserve. We don't agree for the same reasons. Me, because of their inflationary monetary policies and because I'd like to see competition in our monetary system. Them because it's a cabal of international bankers, of Jewish bankers who want to control us because the Rothschilds want to make me 5 minutes late for work, every single day or what have you. But I'm curious your response to this, like Candace Owens and others, Nick Fuentes and others who are getting a lot of traction, at least online, maybe not in the mainstream. I know a lot of no Republicans at the convention that I was at last weekend hold those political views, but it is becoming more popular on the dissident right.
hmm Well, I think the question you're really asking is why does anti-Semitism exist? Because the fact is, this isn't new. This has always been here. Anti-Semitism is a very broad spectrum, and people, especially in the political space, love to talk about it in ways that are advantageous to them. So people on the right will go on and on about left-wing anti-Semitism or Islamic anti-Semitism or black anti-Semitism, but they'll completely ignore right-wing anti-Semitism and vice versa. The left love to go on about white supremacist anti-Semitism, but will then cozy up to Ilhan Omar for a selfie, right? Because
Sure.
you don't
Yeah.
actually care about you don't really care about anti-Semitism. You care about using it as a weapon. So anti-Semitism has always been there, and right now there's a market for it. It's no real surprise that changes in policy on Twitter, for example, and I think changes in policy that are overall good for freedom of speech, but very bad for Jews online. Because right now we're seeing a lot of people who are directly monetizing this stuff because there is a market for it out there. And one other thing I also think ties into a little bit and why Israel is losing the propaganda war is because they will always lose the propaganda war because Jews have always lost the propaganda war. It's always so funny we're accused
They
of
control
controlling the
Hollywood,
media.
but Ian, don't they
Exactly.
control the Hollywood and and media?
Like we're obviously not very good at it, and my bank account needs to have a few more zeros on it before I believe that one. But we control all these things. We control the media. We control the narrative. We control the weather. All of these things, and yet we are the nefarious victims that will always be cast aside. I think a big part of that is that yes, we will always be a minority. Yes, we're disproportionately successful because, like multiple other minority groups, on average, we value education and we push children into things like medicine and being a lawyer, which guess what, pay more than average. Like crazy things like that. Working hard means you earn more. Shock horror. But then people will always need a scapegoat. They'll always need someone to look down on to have an excuse as to why they failed or why they're unhappy with their life. And Jews will always be that because we haven't even got back up to the numbers that there were before World War II. And so if you are that reliable tiny minority that is also successful, then you will always be labeled as this nefarious cause of something. And so I think right now we're seeing two different lanes. One, we're seeing the Nick Fuentes of the world who genuinely believe this. There are a lot of people who genuinely believe, at least I think it's genuine, that Jews are evil, Jews control the world, blah, blah, blah. And then you see the Candace Owens of the world who simply see this as an opportunity. I don't think they necessarily have any actual thoughts. I think a lot of it is just going towards whatever the brightest, shiniest thing in the room is that will get them the most attention. Because if you were to scratch the surface and actually ask why they believe these things, I think Nick Fuentes is a horrific, evil person, but he can actually hold a conversation as to why he believes these abjectly wrong things. And then there are people like Candace Owens, for example, who thinks the Muslim Quarter in Jerusalem is a ghetto for Muslims. There's two very different sides of this debate, but they end up in the same direction, which is hating Jews, usually for profit, which again is ironic given that Jews are accused of being the money grabbing fiends, and yet there's a lot of people making a lot of money off anti-Semitism right now, with
Yeah.
also Hamas propaganda in the background, which we should never forget.
No, for sure, and it's something that we monitor closely, especially on this show. Boy, and it's so refreshing to hear your take on these things because you're so informed on this. For one, am tired of being lectured to about World War II by people who got D's in history class. It's quite obvious, although I do get a little bit of revenge on the D students who love to tweet things like, "Did you know that the Allies bombed Dresden in World War II and they firebombed Dresden and about they killed all the?" I'm like, yes, we learned that in 10th grade. Actually, I'm glad that you're just figuring it out. But of course, for much of it, it's either an attention getting ploy, like you've identified with Candace Owens and others, or it is that they're sincere beliefs, like Nick Fuentes, who think that just Hitler just didn't go hard enough on the Jews. Man, I feel like we could talk about this for hours, Ian. I'd love to have you come back again really soon. It's great to hear your voice on these things, and boy, I just wish I could be more selfish with your time, but I've got to let you go. Thanks so much for joining us. And is there anything that you'd like to share with our listeners or plug before we let you go?
Yeah, please just check out my writings. You can find my social media, IGHAWORTH. And also, you can read my columns for the Washington Examiner. I also have a nationally syndicated column with creators. I'm talking about a lot of this stuff right now from what I hope is a nuanced perspective, the kind of thing we've been discussing right now. So please check it out. Even if you disagree with everything I've said, please check it out. And hopefully, we can find a dialogue that is actually a way of fighting anti Semitism rather than just riling it up on both sides for attention.
Love it. Ian, good stuff. Thank you very much for your time today. Follow him over on XIG Haworth. Thank you very much for your time, Ian, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for having me.
There you go. What do you all think of Ian? Can we get a round of applause? Yes, we can, because I hit that applause button.